Hello, and welcome to the channel. The story you're about to hear is about the men and women whose faces filled the silver screen, yet whose truest lives remained hidden in shadows. It reveals what happens when fame becomes a prison, when love must choose between legitimacy and secrecy, and when the cost of stardom is paid by those who never chose it. Imagine knowing your father's voice from 1,000 movie theaters, yet never hearing him say your name. Imagine watching your mother accept an Oscar while you sit in a darkened apartment across town, forbidden to claim her. Picture yourself as a child, sitting in darkness as the newsreel plays, seeing your parents' face magnified to impossible size, their voice echoing through the theater, while you remain small, unnamed, unacknowledged. You share their eyes, their chin, perhaps even their talent. But you do not share their name. Not publicly, not where it matters. These are the stories of Hollywood's invisible families, the children who bore famous names in secret, the wives who existed only in whispers, the second lives lived behind the golden facade. They are stories of human cost tallied in ledgers that never made it into Variety or The Hollywood Reporter. They speak to questions that haunt us still. What do we owe to those we bring into this world? How much truth can be sacrificed on the altar of image? When does protection become erasure? But to understand how such secrets were possible, we must first understand the machinery of Hollywood itself. Before we meet these hidden families, you need to understand the world that made them necessary, the world that made them inevitable. The studio system that dominated Hollywood from the 1920s through the 1950s was not merely a business model. It was a totalizing apparatus of control that extended from the soundstage into the bedroom, from the premiere to the breakfast table. When a young actor or actress signed a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Paramount, or any of the other major studios, they signed away more than their working hours. They signed away their autonomy over their own image, their own story, their own life. The contracts were explicit about this. 7-year terms renewable at the studio's option. The studio decided which films you made, which you turned down. They decided your name. Archibald Leach became Cary Grant. Norma Jean Mortensen became Marilyn Monroe. Isha Danielovich became Kirk Douglas. If your nose was wrong, the studio paid for rhinoplasty. If your teeth needed straightening, the studio arranged it. If your hairline was receding, they fitted you for a toupee. Your body was their asset, to be modified as they saw fit. But the control extended far beyond the physical. The studios employed an entire infrastructure designed to manufacture not just stars, but the illusion of who those stars were. Publicity departments crafted elaborate backstories, often bearing little resemblance to reality. Fan magazines, which reached millions of American homes, published these fabrications as truth. The major gossip columnists, Luella Parsons at the Hearst Papers, Hedda Hopper at the Los Angeles Times, operated as unofficial enforcers of the system. Cross them, and your career could end with a single column. Cooperate, and your scandals might vanish entirely from the public record. The morality clauses written into every contract gave studios the legal authority to terminate any performer whose behavior might bring disrepute to the studio or damage the commercial prospects of their films. What constituted disrepute was left intentionally vague. In practice, it meant anything the studio decided it meant. Pregnancy outside marriage could trigger it. Divorce could trigger it. Being seen with the wrong person, at the wrong place, at the wrong time could trigger it. For women especially, the morality clause hung like a sword over every decision, every relationship, every private moment that might become public. The fixers made it all work. These were the men, and they were almost always men, employed by the studios to handle problems. Eddie Mannix at MGM was perhaps the most infamous. Howard Strickling, also at MGM, ran the publicity machine with an iron fist. Between them, they could make a drunk driving arrest disappear, convince a newspaper to kill a story about a star's abortion, arrange a hasty marriage to cover an inconvenient pregnancy, or orchestrate a divorce without any journalist asking uncomfortable questions about why. When those measures failed, there were other options. The studios maintained close relationships with local police. An arrest might result in a night in jail, but the paperwork would vanish by morning. Journalists who asked too many questions might find themselves without access to future premieres, future interviews, future revenue. Neighbors of the stars often worked for the studios in some capacity, or depended on studio business for their livelihoods. Everyone had an incentive to see nothing, say nothing, remember nothing. Geography was the secret's greatest ally. In an era before jet travel, before instant communication, before television cameras could beam live images across the country, distance provided cover. A star might maintain a family in New York while working in Los Angeles. They might install a mistress and children in a house in the Hollywood Hills while their legal wife remained in their hometown. Different cities, different social circles, different newspapers. The worlds rarely intersected. The double standard was written into the architecture itself. Male stars could father children outside marriage with relative impunity, as long as the women involved remained silent and the children remained hidden. Female stars faced ruin. A man's affair might be whispered about, winked at, even admired as evidence of virility. A woman's affair ended careers. Pregnancy outside marriage meant exile, often permanent. This was the world in which secrets became not merely possible, but necessary. This was the machine that created the invisible families we are about to meet. Understanding these forces, we can now turn to the individuals who navigated them, beginning with a woman whose wholesome image masked Hollywood's greatest cover-up, and a child who lived her entire childhood as her own mother's lie. In 1935, Loretta Young was 22 years old and one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. She had been working in film since childhood. Her face known to millions, her image carefully cultivated as the embodiment of Catholic virtue and wholesome American beauty. That summer, she traveled to Mount Baker, Washington, to film The Call of the Wild opposite Clark Gable, the industry's biggest male star. When she returned to Los Angeles 3 months later, she carried a secret that would shape the next 60 years of her life and warp the entire childhood of a girl not yet born. The affair between Young and Gable was brief, intense, and by all accounts unexpected. Gable was married, though his marriage to Rhea Langham was already crumbling. Young was devoutly Catholic, her faith genuine and deep. What happened between them in the isolated Washington wilderness has been the subject of much speculation. Young herself would later claim, late in life, that Gable had forced himself on her, a revelation that complicated an already complex story. Whatever the circumstances, by autumn, Young knew she was pregnant. For a female star in 1935, this was not merely a scandal. It was a career death sentence. Young's entire image rested on her virtue. Her fan base was heavily Catholic. The morality clause in her contract was explicit. If the pregnancy became public knowledge, she would be unemployable. Perhaps more importantly to Young, she would be excommunicated from her church. The pregnancy had to be hidden. The cover story was elegant in its simplicity. In December 1935, Young announced she was exhausted from overwork and would be taking an extended vacation in Europe to rest and recover. She left Los Angeles with much publicity and fanfare. She did not go to Europe. She went to a house her mother had quietly rented in Venice, California, close enough to visit easily, but far enough to avoid casual recognition. There, hidden from the world, her pregnancy progressed through winter into spring. On November the 6th, 1935, in a small hospital, Loretta Young gave birth to a daughter. The baby had distinctive ears, large, prominent, and unmistakably similar to Clark Gable's famous ears, which had been the subject of countless magazine articles and caricatures. The baby was perfect, healthy, and utterly damning evidence of her mother's fall from grace. What happened next remains one of Hollywood's most coldly calculated cover-ups. The infant was placed in an orphanage. Not just any orphanage, but a Catholic facility where the nuns could be trusted to be discreet. For 19 months, the baby lived there, visited periodically by her mother, but officially unnamed, unclaimed, existing in bureaucratic limbo, while Loretta Young and her mother constructed an alternative narrative. The story they built was this: Loretta Young, moved by her charitable work with orphans, had become attached to two baby girls at the facility. In a generous act of Christian charity, she was adopting both children. One was named Judy, the other was Jane. The adoption was announced in the press with great fanfare in 1937. Loretta posed for photographs with the two babies, the perfect image of maternal devotion. Fan magazines ran stories about Hollywood's Angel of Mercy opening her home to unwanted children. Judy was, of course, her biological daughter. Jane was returned to the orphanage after a few months. Her role in the performance complete, Judy remained, growing up in her mother's house, calling Loretta mother, but told from her earliest memory that she was adopted. The truth hidden in plain sight. The problem with the lie was physical and undeniable. As Judy grew, the ears became more prominent. They were unmistakably Gable's ears. Everyone who saw her noticed. Studio executives noticed. Other actors noticed. Servants noticed. Columnists noticed, but printed nothing. The conspiracy of silence held because everyone had something to lose if it broke. Judy herself noticed. As a child, she would study photographs of Clark Gable in movie magazines, touching her own ears, seeing the similarity. She asked her mother about it once. Loretta told her it was coincidence, nothing more. The lie was maintained with absolute discipline. There were no slip-ups, no moments of weakness, no tearful confessions. Loretta Young had made her choice, and she adhered to it with the same iron will that had built her career. For Judy, the childhood was psychologically complex in ways she would spend decades untangling. She was raised in privilege, wanting for nothing materially. She had the best schools, beautiful clothes, opportunities most children could never dream of, but she also had a fundamental uncertainty about her own identity, a hole at the center of her understanding of herself. Who were her real parents? Why had they given her up? The questions haunted her, even as the answers sat across the dinner table every evening. The truth came in 1961, when Judy was 26 years old. By then, she was married, a mother herself, trying to build a life separate from her famous parent. A family friend, assuming Judy knew the truth, made a casual reference to her resemblance to Gable. The comment was offhand, unthinking, but it detonated in Judy's consciousness. She confronted her mother. Loretta's response was to admit only what could no longer be denied, and nothing more. Yes, Judy was her biological daughter. Yes, Clark Gable was the father. But it had been rape, Loretta insisted, or something close to it. She had been a victim. The secrecy had been necessary to protect Judy, to protect them both. The narrative shifted, but the fundamental dynamic remained. Loretta controlled the story, controlled the truth, controlled the meaning. Gable had died in 1960, 1 year before Judy learned the truth. She would never have the chance to confront him, to ask him for his version of events, to hear him acknowledge her. That door closed forever before she even knew it existed. Judy Lewis lived another 50 years, dying in 2011. She wrote a memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, published in 1994, in which she told her story with remarkable restraint and absence of bitterness. She built a career as a therapist, specializing in adoption issues. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the psychological architecture of secrets and the damage they inflict across generations. Loretta Young died in 2000 at 87. Even on her deathbed, her relationship with truth remained complicated. She acknowledged Judy publicly at the end, but maintained the rape narrative, protecting her image even as death approached. Some lies, it seems, we carry to the grave, and some children spend their entire lives paying for decisions made before they drew their first breath. Before Errol Flynn became the swashbuckling symbol of Hollywood adventure, before the scandals and the accusations and the tabloid headlines, there was a woman named Naomi Campbell Dibbs. She was his wife. For years, she was legally bound to him, living in the shadow of his rising fame. Yet when film historians write about Flynn's life, when biographers catalogue his marriages, Naomi often appears as a footnote, if she appears at all. She was erased so thoroughly from his official narrative that even her existence became questionable, a rumor whispered about, but rarely confirmed. Flynn arrived in Hollywood in 1935, a 26-year-old Australian adventurer with devastating good looks and a gift for self-invention. Warner Brothers saw in him the potential for a new kind of leading man. Dashing, physical, dangerous. They cast him in Captain Blood, and the film made him an instant star. But Warner Brothers also saw a problem. Flynn was married. He had wed Naomi in 1935, before his Hollywood arrival. She was an Australian actress, beautiful and sophisticated, but utterly unmarketable in the American system. More critically, Flynn married contradicted the image Warner Brothers was carefully constructing. They wanted him to be the bachelor adventurer, the rogue, the man every woman in America could fantasize about winning. A wife destroyed that fantasy. The studio's solution was simple and brutal. The marriage would not exist publicly. The arrangement required Naomi's cooperation, whether willing or coerced. She would not appear with Flynn at premieres or parties. She would not be photographed with him. She would not give interviews about their relationship. She would, in essence, not exist in his Hollywood life. In return, she would receive financial support and the legal status of being Mrs. Flynn in private, even as that title was denied to her in public. The mechanics of the erasure were methodical. Studio publicity materials described Flynn as single. Fan magazine profiles portrayed him as a confirmed bachelor, too restless and adventurous for domesticity. When journalists asked about his romantic life, the studio's publicists steered conversations toward his various co-stars, manufacturing rumors of affairs with leading ladies while the actual wife remained invisible. The Los Angeles press corps, dependent on studio access, cooperated fully. For Naomi, the arrangement meant living in a strange twilight. She occupied a house Flynn paid for, wore jewelry he bought her, bore his name legally. But she attended none of his film openings, met none of his famous friends, appeared in none of the photographs that documented his life. When Flynn was photographed at nightclubs with actresses, she read about it in the newspapers like any other reader. When gossip columns speculated about which starlet had captured his heart, she remained silent. The emotional toll was cumulative and devastating. Marriage without acknowledgement is a unique form of torture. Naomi was bound to a man who could not publicly claim her, faithful to vows that officially did not exist. Every movie magazine that called Flynn a bachelor, every column that described him as Hollywood's most eligible man, was a small erasure of her reality. The marriage deteriorated under the weight of the secret. Flynn's drinking increased. His affairs, which began as publicity stunts, became real. The geographical separation, he worked in Los Angeles, she often retreated to their property elsewhere, became emotional distance. By 1937, the marriage was over in all but legal formality, but even the divorce had to be managed carefully. A public divorce would require acknowledging the marriage had existed in the first place. The solution was a quiet settlement in 1942, 7 years after the wedding. The divorce papers were filed in a jurisdiction where they would attract minimal attention. No press conference was held. No official statement was released. Naomi received a financial settlement, signed documents that likely included confidentiality clauses, and disappeared from Flynn's story entirely. What makes Naomi's erasure particularly striking is how complete it was. Flynn went on to marry twice more, to Nora Eddington in 1943 and Patrice Wymore in 1950. Both marriages were public, photographed, discussed in fan magazines. Both wives appeared on his arm at premieres, were interviewed about their lives with him, existed fully in the public record. Naomi's marriage, longer than his marriage to Eddington, vanished as though it had never happened. The erasure extended beyond Flynn's lifetime. When he died in 1959, obituaries listed his marriages as Eddington and Wymore. Biographies published in subsequent decades often failed to mention Naomi at all, or relegated her to a brief mention in early chapters. The studio's manufactured reality had become the accepted historical record. The woman who had been his wife during his greatest professional triumphs, who had been married to him when he became a star, was systematically written out of his history. Naomi herself maintained the silence for the rest of her life. She did not write a tell-all memoir. She did not give interviews to set the record straight. She did not seek compensation or recognition as Flynn became more famous. Whether this silence was her choice, the result of legal agreements, or simply exhaustion with a story that had brought her nothing but pain, we cannot know. She died in obscurity, her obituary making no mention of her years as Mrs. Errol Flynn. The pattern Flynn's first marriage established would repeat throughout his life and throughout Hollywood. The studio's willingness to erase an inconvenient wife demonstrated the absolute power they wielded over narrative. If a marriage could be made to vanish, what else could be hidden? What other lives, other relationships, other children could be systematically removed from the record? For Naomi Campbell Dibbs, the answer was absolute. She became a ghost, a woman who existed in legal documents and fading memories, but nowhere in the official story of one of Hollywood's greatest stars. Her erasure was so successful that even today, most people who know Flynn's name have never heard hers. She was married to fame, but fame refused to acknowledge her. And in that refusal, she learned a truth that many others would learn. In Hollywood's golden age, the studios did not merely manufacture stars. They manufactured reality itself. And in that manufactured reality, some people simply ceased to exist. Charles Chaplin was, by any measure, a genius. He revolutionized cinema, created an art form, gave the world an icon in The Little Tramp that transcended language and culture. His films remain masterpieces of comedy and pathos, studied in film schools, treasured in archives, celebrated as monuments of human creativity. But genius does not excuse everything, and Chaplin's personal life revealed a pattern that, examined honestly, shows how talent and fame could shield behavior that would destroy lesser men. The pattern began early. In 1918, Chaplin was 29 years old and already the most famous comedian in the world. Mildred Harris was 16, a minor actress with limited talent but considerable beauty. They met at a party. Within months, she was pregnant, or believed she was. Chaplin married her hastily, driven by scandal avoidance more than affection. The pregnancy either miscarried or was a false alarm. Accounts differ. A son was born the following year, but died after 3 days. The marriage, built on panic and obligation, collapsed into mutual resentment within 2 years. The divorce in 1920 was ugly and public. Mildred accused Chaplin of cruelty and neglect. He accused her of being a gold digger who had trapped him into marriage. The California courts, unimpressed with both parties, granted the divorce and awarded Mildred a substantial settlement. The newspapers covered every detail. For a brief moment, Chaplin's reputation suffered. Then he released The Kid, one of his greatest films, and public adoration drowned out the scandal. The pattern was established. Misbehavior, scandal, brilliant work. forgiveness. 4 years later, the pattern repeated with modifications. Lita Gray was 12 years old when Chaplin first noticed her on the set of The Kid. By the time she was 15, he was pursuing her actively. She became pregnant at 16. Chaplin was 35. To avoid statutory rape charges and the complete destruction of his career, he married her in a secret ceremony in Mexico in November 1924, just before her 17th birthday. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning. Lita was a child trying to navigate a relationship with a man twice her age, famous, controlling, and psychologically complex. She bore him 2 sons, Charles Jr. in 1925 and Sidney in 1926. But motherhood at 16 and 17 did not mature her into the companion Chaplin wanted. He grew resentful. She grew depressed. The age gap that seemed manageable during courtship became an unbridgeable chasm in daily life. The divorce in 1927 was explosive. Lita's lawyers filed a 52-page complaint that detailed Chaplin's behavior in language so explicit that the court sealed portions of it. The document accused him of infidelity, sexual demands she found degrading, and psychological cruelty. It described his affairs with other actresses, his suggestions that Lita engage in acts she refused, his threats when she proved insufficiently compliant. The filing became one of the most sensational documents in Hollywood history, whispered about, but rarely read in full. Chaplin settled, paying Lita $825,000, an enormous sum in 1927, equivalent to millions today. He retained custody of neither son, though he would have relationships with both as they grew older. The scandal should have ended him. The details were damning, the accusations horrific. But Chaplin was Chaplin. He left for Europe, made more films, and gradually rehabilitated his image. Within a few years, the public had largely forgiven him. Genius has a way of blurring moral lines. The third marriage was to Paulette Goddard in 1936. She was 26, he was 47. The marriage was secret, possibly not legally valid, and conducted on a boat during a trip to Asia. They never confirmed the marriage publicly during their relationship. Goddard later claimed they had married, but documentation was sparse. They separated in 1942, divorced quietly if they had married at all, and Goddard moved on to other relationships. This marriage, unlike the first two, produced no children and no scandal. It was, by Chaplin standards, almost normal. Then came Una O'Neill. She was 18 years old in 1943, the daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. Chaplin was 54. The age difference was 36 years. She could have been his granddaughter. Eugene O'Neill was so disgusted by the relationship that he disowned his daughter entirely, refusing to speak to her for the rest of his life. But Una was of legal age, and Chaplin had learned from previous scandals to wait until legality was unquestionable. They married in June 1943. To everyone's surprise, including perhaps their own, the marriage worked. Una was devoted to Chaplin in ways his previous wives had never been. She bore him 8 children over the next 18 years: Geraldine, Michael, Josephine, Victoria, Eugene, Jane, Annette, and Christopher. The family eventually settled in Switzerland After Chaplin was effectively exiled from America in 1952 during the Red Scare, his political views and moral scandals finally catching up with him. The children born to Una grew up in Swiss luxury, distant from Hollywood, raised by a father in his 60s and 70s. Some became actors, some artists, some lived private lives away from public scrutiny, but all grew up with the knowledge that their father had a history, that he had married their mother when she was barely out of childhood, that he had left behind other children and other wives in America. Charles Jr. and Sidney, the sons from the Lita Gray marriage, had more difficult lives. They struggled with their father's fame, with his absence from their childhood, with the knowledge that he had started a new family in Europe while they remained in California. Charles Jr. became an actor, but never escaped his father's shadow. He died at 42. Sidney had a somewhat more successful career, but also grappled with the legacy of being Charlie Chaplin's forgotten son. Chaplin died in 1977, at 88, surrounded by Una and the Swiss children. His legacy as a filmmaker remained untouchable, but his personal legacy was more complicated. 4 marriages, the first 3 to teenagers, one when the bride was 16, multiple children across decades, a pattern of pursuing girls barely past puberty, using his fame and power to access them, and then discarding them when they proved insufficiently compliant or when scandal threatened. The genius remained, the films remained, but so did the girls, grown into women, carrying the weight of those early marriages, those early betrayals. And so did the children, scattered across continents and decades, united by a father who gave the world laughter while creating private pain in those who bore his name. Joan Crawford built her career on control. Every aspect of her image was carefully managed, from her eyebrows to her shoulder pads to the legend of her rise from poverty to stardom. When she decided to become a mother through adoption, it was not a spontaneous act of maternal impulse. It was a calculated decision, undertaken when marriage to Franchot Tone was ending, and her career needed a new narrative. Motherhood would be her next role, performed for the cameras as meticulously as any of her film performances. The first adoption came in 1940. Christina was an infant, obtained through a grey market adoption network that asked few questions of movie stars. Crawford staged elaborate photo shoots showing herself as devoted mother, the baby perfectly dressed, the house perfectly appointed. Fan magazines ran stories about Hollywood's most glamorous mother. The publicity was exactly what Crawford wanted. But Christina was not the compliant prop Crawford had envisioned. A year later, Crawford adopted a boy. She named him Christopher. He was 11 months old when he arrived at her home, already past infancy, already developing a personality that would prove incompatible with Crawford's vision of perfect children. Where Christina was dramatic and rebellious, Christopher was quieter, but no more manageable. He cried when he was supposed to be silent. He failed to perform on cue for photographers. He was, in short, a real child, rather than a prop. What happened next remains one of the most chilling details in the Crawford family saga. Within months of Christopher's arrival, Crawford attempted to return him to the adoption agency. Like a defective purchase, like merchandise that did not meet specifications, she tried to send the boy back. The agency refused. Adoptions, once finalized, were permanent. Christopher would remain, but the rejection marked him. For the rest of his childhood, Christopher knew he was unwanted. Crawford made no secret of her preference for Christina, despite their battles. Christopher was the afterthought, the mistake, the child she had tried to unmake. He grew up in a household where love was conditional on performance, where approval was earned through perfect behavior, where failure meant not just punishment, but existential threat. In 1947, Crawford adopted twin daughters, Kathy and Cindy. They were infants, more moldable than the older children, and Crawford seemed to find in them what she had wanted all along, children who could be shaped into her image. The twins were dressed identically, photographed constantly, displayed as evidence of Crawford's maternal devotion. They were, by all accounts, more compliant than Christina and Christopher, or perhaps they simply learned earlier to perform the role Crawford demanded. The household Crawford maintained was rigorous to the point of cruelty. Cleanliness was not merely important, it was obsessive. Children were not allowed to have normal childhoods. Christopher and Christina bore the brunt of her rage, but all four children lived under the shadow of her control. Punishments were severe, sometimes physical, always psychologically damaging. Crawford believed she was instilling discipline, creating strength. She was creating trauma. Christopher, already marked by the attempted return, became the quietest of the four children. He retreated into himself, learned to be invisible, developed coping mechanisms that would serve him poorly in later life. Where Christina would eventually fight back and expose their mother's cruelty in her memoir, Mommy Dearest, Christopher remained more circumspect, his pain more private. The final rejection came after Crawford's death in 1977. Her will, read to the gathered family, contained a clause that would become infamous. It is my intention to make no provision herein for my son Christopher or my daughter Christina, for reasons which are well known to them. The phrase, reasons which are well known to them, was calculated cruelty. It implied wrongdoing on the children's part, without specifying what they had done. It was accusation without defense, conviction without trial. Christina and Christopher were disinherited, cut off not just from Crawford's substantial estate, but from any acknowledgement of their relationship to her. The twins, Kathy and Cindy, inherited everything. Christina's response was to write Mommy Dearest, published in 1978. The book was scorching, detailing years of abuse, presenting Crawford as a monster of narcissism and cruelty. It became a bestseller, then a cult film. Christina found vindication, or at least an audience for her pain. She made a career of exposing their mother. Christopher took a different path. He spoke about the abuse, confirmed Christina's account, but did not seek the spotlight. His testimony was quieter, but no less damning. He described the attempted return, the years of feeling unwanted, the impossibility of ever earning Crawford's love. But he did not build his life around the story. He tried, with varying success, to move beyond it. Kathy and Cindy, the twins who inherited, defended their mother, They gave interviews describing a different Crawford, a loving mother who had been unfairly maligned by bitter children. The family fractured along these lines, the older children insisting on their truth, the younger children presenting an alternative narrative. Who was right? Perhaps both. Perhaps Crawford was capable of different relationships with different children. Perhaps the twins, arriving later and more compliant, received the version of Crawford that Christopher and Christina never knew. Or perhaps the twins, inheriting everything, had reasons to maintain the myth. Perhaps they needed to believe in the loving mother because the alternative, that they had been merely more successful performers in Crawford's theatre of motherhood, was too painful to accept. Christopher Crawford lived until 2006, dying at 63. His life after Crawford's death was marked by struggles with alcohol and failed relationships. The legacy of attempted return, of fundamental rejection by the person who was supposed to love him unconditionally, shaped everything that followed. He was the child Joan Crawford tried to unmake, and though he survived her attempt, he never fully escaped it. The question Christopher's story raises is difficult. Were these secret families at all? Everything was photographed, publicized, presented to the world as evidence of Crawford's maternal devotion. There was no hidden child, no concealed relationship, but there were hidden realities. The abuse behind the publicity photos, the rejection beneath the performance of love, the truth that no camera captured because Crawford controlled which cameras were allowed in. Perhaps the deepest secrets are not the ones completely hidden, but the ones hidden in plain sight. Christopher Crawford was known to the world as Joan Crawford's son, but the truth of what that meant, the reality of that relationship, remained secret until after her death. And by then, for Christopher, vindication came too late to heal the damage done by the woman who had tried to return him like unwanted merchandise when he was just a baby. Merle Oberon was born Estelle Merle O'Brien Thompson on February 19th, 1911, in Bombay, India. This much is fact. Everything else about her early life, as she told it to Hollywood, was fiction. The elaborately constructed lie was not vanity. It was survival. In an industry and an era where racial barriers were absolute, where even a trace of non-white ancestry could end a career before it began, Oberon made a choice. She would erase her true origins and create a past that Hollywood could accept. The truth was this. Oberon's mother was Charlotte Selby, a woman of mixed Sinhalese and European descent. Her father's identity remains uncertain, possibly a British railway engineer, possibly someone else entirely. What mattered was not the specifics, but the implications. Oberon was mixed race in an era when that designation meant exclusion from the highest levels of society and absolute exclusion from Hollywood stardom. The greatest beauties of the screen were white or passed for white. There was no third option. The fabricated story Oberon told was intricate and sustained with remarkable discipline throughout her entire career. She claimed to have been born in Tasmania, Australia, to a wealthy British family. Her parents, she said, had died when she was young, leaving her an orphan of genteel background and European pedigree. The story was designed to explain her exotic looks while maintaining racial acceptability. Dark hair and eyes could be Mediterranean, could be simply striking European beauty. As long as the narrative held, the questions would not be asked. But maintaining the lie required sacrifices that went beyond simple dishonesty. It required the erasure of her family. Her mother, Charlotte, could not be acknowledged as her mother. Her brother could not be claimed. The entire network of relatives and childhood connections had to be severed, at least publicly. Oberon accomplished this through a cruelty that perhaps haunted her, though she never admitted it publicly. She brought her mother to Hollywood as her maid. Charlotte Selby arrived in California in the late 1930s, after Oberon had already established herself as a star. She moved into Oberon's household, not as mother, but as servant. She lived in the maid's quarters. She served tea when Oberon entertained guests. She answered to Charlotte, rather than any maternal designation. She watched her daughter rise to the heights of Hollywood fame while remaining invisible as her parent. The psychological toll of this arrangement on both women is almost impossible to imagine. For Charlotte, it meant being close to her daughter while being fundamentally separated from her. She could see Oberon every day, could live in the same house, could be part of her life in the most intimate daily ways, but she could never claim the relationship, never acknowledge the bond, never receive public recognition as the woman who had given birth to and raised this celebrated actress. For Oberon, it meant living with constant fear and constant duplicity. Every social gathering where Charlotte served drinks was a potential exposure. Every journalist interview, every publicity appearance, every moment in the public eye carried the risk that someone would recognize Charlotte, would see the resemblance, would ask uncomfortable questions. The secret was not merely about her past, but about her present, maintained daily in her own home. The elaborate charade required the cooperation of household staff, who knew the truth but remained silent. It required careful management of social circles, ensuring that those who knew Charlotte before Hollywood never overlapped with those who knew Oberon, the star. It required Charlotte herself to participate in her own erasure, to accept the role of servant to her own child. There were close calls. Visitors sometimes remarked on Charlotte's features, on something familiar in her face. Oberon would deflect with casual mentions of coincidence, or how certain types of features ran common among certain regions. She became expert at misdirection, at changing subjects, at ensuring conversations never lingered too long on Charlotte's background or history. Oberon's marriages became part of the performance of whiteness. She married first Alexander Korda, the Hungarian-British film producer and director, in 1939. The marriage was brief and unhappy, ending in divorce in 1945. Her second marriage, to British industrialist Sir Alexander Korda in 1945, brought her into the British aristocracy. Her third marriage, to Italian industrialist Bruno Pagliai in 1957, connected her to European wealth and society. Each marriage moved her further from her origins, deeper into the world of wealthy, white, international society. The final marriage, to actor Robert Wolders in 1975, lasted until her death. Wolders was Dutch, cultured, connected to European society. With him, Oberon lived out her final years in Mexico, far from Hollywood, far from the machinery that had required her secret, but still maintaining it. The lie had become so fundamental to her identity that she could not abandon it even when the original need had passed. Charlotte Selby died in 1945, still officially Oberon's maid. She had spent the final years of her life watching her daughter from servants' quarters, never publicly acknowledged, never honored. What conversations they had in private, what acknowledgements passed between them when no witnesses were present, we cannot know. But Charlotte went to her grave as an unnamed servant, rather than as the mother of a star. Oberon herself died in 1979 at 68 from a stroke. The truth about her origins emerged only after her death, when researchers and biographers began digging into records, comparing stories, finding the inconsistencies in her Tasmania narrative. Birth records from Bombay emerged. Charlotte's true relationship was documented. The elaborate fiction collapsed, but only once it no longer mattered to Oberon's career or social position. The family members Oberon had left behind in India, the brother and others who had been erased from her narrative, learned of her fame only distantly. Some may never have known how famous their relative had become. They were disappeared from her story as thoroughly as Charlotte had been hidden in plain sight. The cost of passing was measured not just in lies told to the public, but in relationships severed, in family denied. What makes Oberon's story particularly tragic is that the choice was not irrational. The racial barriers she faced were real and absolute. Had she acknowledged her mixed-race heritage, she would never have achieved stardom in the 1930s and 1940s Hollywood. The roles she played, the leading men she kissed on screen, the status she achieved, all of it would have been impossible. The system forced the choice upon her. She simply made it, and then lived with the consequences for 40 years. But those consequences included watching her mother serve tea to people who did not know they were being served by Merle Oberon's mother. They included a lifetime of fear that the truth would emerge and destroy everything. They included the severing of family bonds that could never be publicly repaired. Oberon passed for white successfully, completely, and at a cost that she carried silently until her death. Bing Crosby was America's voice for a generation. His recordings of White Christmas and other standards defined an era. His films brought comfort during the Depression and World War II. His radio show reached millions weekly. The public image was carefully maintained. The easygoing crooner, the devoted Catholic, the loving father. The reality, hidden behind that image, was considerably darker and more complex. Crosby's first marriage, to actress and singer Dixie Lee in 1930, produced 4 sons: Gary Evan in 1933, twins Dennis Michael and Philip Lang in 1934, and Lindsay Harry in 1938. The boys grew up in privilege, the children of one of the most famous entertainers in the world. They attended the best schools, wanted for nothing materially, and appeared occasionally in publicity photos showing the wholesome Crosby family. What those photos did not show was the emotional void at the center of their childhood. Crosby was, by all accounts, including those of his sons, a distant and often harsh father. His parenting philosophy combined rigid Catholic discipline with the emotional unavailability common to men of his generation and status. He believed in strict rules, immediate punishment for infractions, and the withholding of affection as motivation for better behavior. What he called discipline, his sons would later describe as cruelty. Gary Crosby's autobiography, Going My Own Way, published in 1983, 3 years after Bing's death, shattered the carefully maintained image. The book detailed years of physical punishment, emotional abuse, and an atmosphere of fear in the Crosby household. Gary described beatings with a belt for minor infractions, described the constant tension of trying to meet impossible standards, described a father who seemed incapable of expressing love or approval. The most damning aspect of Gary's account was not the specific incidents of abuse, though those were disturbing enough. It was the portrait of emotional absence. Bing was often physically absent due to his career, traveling for films and concerts and recordings. But even when present, he was emotionally unavailable, maintaining a distance from his sons that seemed impenetrable. They were expected to be perfect, silent, invisible, except when performing for photographs or public appearances. Dixie Lee, the boy's mother, struggled with alcoholism throughout the marriage. Whether her drinking was cause or effect of the troubled household is unclear, probably both in a self-reinforcing cycle. She died in 1952 at 40 years old, her health destroyed by alcohol. The boys lost their mother and were left alone with their increasingly famous, increasingly distant father. 3 months after Dixie's death, Bing married Catherine Grant. She was 23 years old. He was 54. The age difference was substantial, but not scandalous by Hollywood standards. What was striking was the transformation in Crosby's behavior as a father to his second family. With Catherine, Crosby had 3 children: Harry Lillis III in 1958, Mary Frances in 1959, and Nathaniel Patrick in 1961. These children grew up in a completely different environment from their older half-brothers. The rigid discipline softened, the emotional distance lessened. Crosby, now in his 50s and 60s, seemed capable of the warmth and affection he had withheld from his first family. The contrast was stark and painful for the older sons to witness. Harry, Mary, and Nathaniel spoke in later years of a father who attended their school events, who showed interest in their lives, who seemed genuinely proud of them. This was not the father Gary, Dennis, Philip, and Lindsay had known. Same man, entirely different parent. The question of why Crosby changed is difficult to answer. Perhaps age had mellowed him. Perhaps the different era, the 1960s versus the 1930s and 1940s, shifted his parenting philosophy. Perhaps Catherine's influence moderated his worst impulses. Perhaps he simply loved his second family in ways he had been incapable of loving the first. Whatever the reason, the result was 2 sets of children with radically different experiences of the same father. For the older sons, the divergent treatment compounded the original wounds. It was one thing to have a cold, abusive father and believe he was incapable of being otherwise. It was another to watch him become warm and involved with his younger children. It suggested that the problem had not been his capacity for affection, but his willingness to extend it to them specifically. They had not been unlucky to have a damaged father. They had been unloved by a father capable of love. The long-term consequences played out in the older sons' lives with tragic clarity. Dennis struggled with alcoholism and depression for years before killing himself in 1991 at 56. Lindsay also battled substance abuse and died by suicide in 1989 at 51. Philip survived longer, but also struggled with alcohol throughout his life, dying in 2004 at 69. Gary, who had broken the silence with his memoir, died in 1995 at 62, his health compromised by decades of smoking and drinking. None of the 4 sons from the first marriage lived to 70. All struggled with addiction. 2 died by their own hands. The legacy of their childhood with Bing Crosby was written in these outcomes. The younger children, by contrast, had more stable lives. They defended their father against Gary's allegations, insisting their experience had been loving and supportive. They were not lying. Their experience had been different, but their defense of their father required them to either dismiss or minimize their older brother's pain. The family fractured along these lines, the 2 sets of children unable to reconcile their incompatible realities. Bing Crosby died in 1977 at 74, still beloved by the public, still celebrated as an entertainer and a cultural icon. The revelations about his first family came later, after he could not respond, after the image had been set in the public mind. Some fans rejected Gary's account entirely, unwilling to believe their beloved crooner could have been cruel. Others accepted it, but saw it as a private failing, separate from his public achievements. But for the sons of the first marriage, there was no separation between public and private. They lived the private reality every day. They watched their father perform warmth for audiences while withholding it from them. They grew up as children of Bing Crosby and learned that being his son meant living in the shadow of an image that denied their reality. The Crosby family was never secret. The existence of all 7 children was public knowledge. But the reality of those families, the emotional brutality of the first, the comparative warmth of the second, remained hidden for decades. And when the truth emerged, it revealed something more disturbing than a hidden child or concealed marriage. It revealed that the same man could be 2 completely different fathers, and that the children who received his coldness would carry that wound for the rest of their abbreviated lives. In 1949, Ingrid Bergman was not merely a movie star. She was America's moral exemplar, the embodiment of wholesome beauty and unimpeachable virtue. Her roles in Casablanca, For Whom the Bell Tolls and Gaslight, had made her one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses. More importantly, her off-screen image matched her on-screen persona. She was married to Dr. Petter Lindstrom, a neurosurgeon. They had a daughter, Pia, born in 1938. The family represented stability, propriety, European sophistication, combined with American values. When that image shattered, it shattered completely and publicly, and the reverberations changed Bergman's life forever. The affair began in Italy. Bergman had traveled there to work with director Roberto Rossellini on the film Stromboli. Rossellini was married. Bergman was married. Both were drawn to each other despite, or perhaps because, of the complications. The affair was passionate, reckless, and impossible to hide once Bergman realized she was pregnant in late 1949. In an earlier era, or with a different star, The studios might have managed the scandal. An abortion could have been arranged quietly. The marriage to Rossellini could have been expedited before the pregnancy showed. But Bergman was in Italy, beyond Hollywood's control. And more critically, her image was so thoroughly wholesome that the revelation of adultery and pregnancy would cause more damage than any cover-up could prevent. The truth would come out. The only question was how. Bergman made the choice to stay in Italy, to have the child, to marry Rossellini after both obtained divorces. In making that choice, she understood she was ending her American career. The moral climate of 1950 America did not forgive adultery, especially not from women, whose entire appeal rested on virtue. She could have the baby, or she could have Hollywood. She could not have both. The American public's reaction was swift and vicious. Bergman was denounced from pulpits, her films pulled from theaters. Most dramatically, Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado took to the Senate floor in March 1950 to deliver a speech condemning Bergman as a powerful influence for evil and calling for her to be banned from American films. A United States senator, speaking in the Chamber of Government, declared a Swedish actress a moral threat to the nation. The speech was reported in newspapers across the country. Bergman, reading about it in Italy, understood that exile would not be temporary. Roberto Robertino Rossellini was born on February 2nd, 1950. He was a healthy baby boy, born to parents who were not yet legally married to each other. The birth made headlines worldwide. American publications covered it with a tone of scandal and condemnation. Bergman and Rossellini married in May 1950. After their respective divorces were finalized, the marriage legitimized Robertino, but did nothing to restore Bergman's reputation in America. 3 years later, in 1952, Bergman gave birth to twin daughters, Isabella Fiorella, Elettra Giovanna, and Isotta, Ingrid Frida Juliana. The twins would later become notable in their own right. Isabella as a model and actress, Isotta as a scholar and professor. But in 1952, they were simply more evidence of Bergman's new life, the Italian family that had replaced her American image. The children grew up in Italy and France, raised by parents whose marriage was turbulent and ultimately doomed. Rossellini was a difficult partner, controlling and unfaithful. The artistic collaboration that had brought them together proved less sustainable than the passion. They divorced in 1957, Bergman's second failed marriage. Meanwhile, back in America, Bergman's daughter from her first marriage faced her own struggles. Pia Lindström was 11 years old when her mother left for Italy. She was 12 when the scandal broke, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to read the newspapers calling her mother a homewrecker, and worse. She remained in California with her father, who was bitter about the divorce and the public humiliation. Pia's relationship with her mother became strained and complex. Bergman had left her to pursue love and career in Italy. Pia felt abandoned, caught between loyalty to her father and love for her mother. The situation was made worse by the public nature of the scandal. Pia's classmates knew who her mother was. She could not escape the story. The years of exile were professionally fallow for Bergman. She made films with Rossellini, but they were artistic rather than commercial, appreciated by critics, but not by mass audiences. The American market remained closed to her. The woman who had been a top box office draw became unemployable in Hollywood. Her punishment for following her heart was professional destruction. The rehabilitation began slowly. In 1956, 7 years after the scandal, Bergman was cast in Anastasia, playing a woman claiming to be the lost Russian princess. The role was perfect for her situation. A woman trying to reclaim an identity, to be recognized and accepted again. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She did not attend the ceremony, still uncertain of her welcome, but the award itself was a signal that forgiveness might be possible. Gradually, Bergman worked her way back into American cinema and American affections. She made more films, won more awards, rebuilt her career, if not to its previous heights, then at least to respectability. The moral panic that had driven her into exile faded as the culture changed, as the 1960s brought different attitudes about marriage and sexuality. But the cost of those 7 years could never be fully recovered. Bergman lost the prime years of her career. She lost daily connection with her oldest daughter during critical years of Pia's adolescence. She endured public condemnation of a type and intensity that would have broken many people. And she lived the rest of her life knowing that she had been made an example, that her sin had been not just adultery, but daring to choose her own happiness over public expectations. The children of her second marriage grew up bearing the weight of that scandal. They were born from the affair that destroyed their mother's career. Their very existence was evidence of her transgression. They learned early that their family story was public property, that strangers had opinions about their legitimacy and their mother's choices. Bergman died in 1982 at 67 on her birthday from breast cancer. By then, she had been forgiven by Hollywood, honored with 3 Academy Awards, celebrated again as one of cinema's great actresses. But the forgiveness came with conditions and caveats. She was forgiven for being human, for following desire, but she was never allowed to forget that forgiveness had been necessary. The scandal defined her life as much as her talent did. And the children, Robertino, Isabella, Isotta, and Pia, lived with the legacy of choices made before they were old enough to understand them, choices that shaped their childhoods and their relationships with their mother. They were not secret children. They were scandal children, which in some ways was worse. Clark Gable was known as the King of Hollywood, and like many kings, he believed certain rules applied differently to him. His affair with Loretta Young and the daughter it produced, Judy Lewis, became one of Hollywood's most famous secret families once the truth emerged. But Judy Lewis was not the only child Gable may have fathered outside his marriages. The rumors and allegations that surfaced during his life, and especially after his death, suggest a pattern of unacknowledged children scattered across his decades of fame. Understanding Gable's approach to these situations requires understanding his position in the Hollywood hierarchy. From the mid-1930s through the 1950s, Gable was MGM's most valuable property. Louis B. Mayer protected him with the full resources of the studio's machinery. When a woman claimed Gable had fathered her child, the studio's lawyers and fixers would investigate. If the claims seemed credible, a financial settlement would be offered, always with strict confidentiality agreements. The woman would receive money, often substantial amounts. In return, she would sign documents promising never to publicly name Gable as the father, never to seek additional support, never to allow the child to contact him. The system worked because it served everyone's interests except the children's. The women received financial security. Gable avoided scandal. The studio protected its asset. Only the children grew up with questions about their fathers, with gaps in their identities that money could not fill. The most documented case beyond Judy Lewis involves a woman named Violet Norton. In 1937, she gave birth to a daughter and claimed Gable was the father. The studio investigated. The timeline was possible. Gable had been in the location Norton claimed at the relevant time. Rather than fight the claim publicly, MGM arranged a settlement. Norton received a lump sum and ongoing payments. The daughter grew up knowing Gable was allegedly her father, but having no relationship with him, no acknowledgement, no connection beyond the checks that arrived to support her upbringing. Then there were the more speculative claims. Multiple women over the years alleged that Gable had fathered their children. Some of these claims were clearly opportunistic, the timelines impossible, or the evidence non-existent. But others fell into a grey area where the truth was unknowable without DNA testing, which did not exist during Gable's lifetime and which his estate resisted after his death. One such case involved an actress named Gail Russell, who worked with Gable in the 1940s. Russell, who struggled with alcoholism and died young in 1961, allegedly gave birth to a child she claimed was Gable's. The evidence was circumstantial. They had worked together. She had been pregnant during the time frame. The child had some physical resemblance, but Russell never pursued the claim aggressively, either because she had signed a confidentiality agreement or because she feared the professional consequences of publicly accusing Hollywood royalty. What makes assessing these claims difficult is the systematic destruction of evidence. The studio's fixers kept records, but those records were confidential, and many were destroyed when the studio system collapsed. The women who signed confidentiality agreements could not speak without risking legal action and the loss of financial support. And Gable himself, in his few comments on such matters, maintained blanket denials. He acknowledged no children beyond his legitimate son, John Clark Gable, born to his fifth wife Kay Williams, 4 months after Gable's death in 1960. The protection Gable enjoyed extended beyond his lifetime. His estate, managed by his widow Kay, and later by executors, aggressively fought any claims or allegations. When DNA testing became available in later decades, the estate consistently refused to cooperate with testing requests from alleged children or descendants. Without Gable's DNA for comparison, and without cooperation from his legitimate descendants, proving paternity became nearly impossible. The double standard in how male and female stars' sexual indiscretions were handled is nowhere clearer than in comparing Gable and Loretta Young's situations. Young hid her pregnancy, gave up her daughter to an orphanage, constructed an elaborate adoption story, and lived in fear of exposure for decades. Gable simply paid off the problems and continued his career without interruption. The same act, extramarital sex resulting in pregnancy, led to potential ruin for her and minor inconvenience for him. Even more striking is the difference in how their acknowledged child, Judy Lewis, was treated by each parent. Young, despite the cruelty of the initial cover-up, at least raised Judy herself, provided her with a home, acknowledged her as daughter, if not as biological daughter. Gable never acknowledged Judy at all. He saw her once when she was 15 at a party, and while he surely recognized his own distinctive features in her face, he said nothing. He made no attempt to establish a relationship, provided no financial support, left her nothing in his will. This was the pattern Gable maintained with all his alleged children: complete non-acknowledgement, combined with financial settlements designed to ensure silence. It was a system that served his interests perfectly, and the children's interests not at all. They grew up with famous faces and empty spaces where a father should be. Carol Lombard, Gable's third wife, and by all accounts his great love, knew about at least some of these situations. Lombard died in 1942 in a plane crash, and with her died whatever knowledge she had of Gable's secrets. His later wives, Lady Sylvia Ashley, 1949 to 1952, and Kay Williams Gable, 1955 to 1960, either did not know the full extent of the allegations or chose to maintain the public image of Gable as faithful husband. The question of how many children Gable actually fathered may never be answered definitively. Judy Lewis is confirmed. The others remain allegations, rumors, claims impossible to prove or disprove, without evidence that no longer exists or cooperation that will not be given. What is certain is that Gable's fame and the studio's power created an environment where such secrets could be maintained, where women could be paid to remain silent, and where children could grow up knowing they were probably related to one of the most famous men in the world, but unable to prove it or claim it. When Gable died of a heart attack in 1960 at 59, the obituaries celebrated his career and mourned his death. They mentioned his 5 marriages, his service in World War II, his iconic roles. None mentioned the children he may have fathered and never claimed. Those children, or alleged children, read the obituaries like everyone else, mourning a father who had never acknowledged them, who had left them nothing but questions and the distinctive features that marked them as possibly his. The King of Hollywood died as he had lived, surrounded by adulation, his secrets maintained by money and power, and the systematic silencing of anyone who might tell inconvenient truths. Yul Brynner constructed himself as carefully as any Hollywood star, perhaps more carefully than most. Everything about him was deliberate. The shaved head that became his trademark, the exotic accent that suggested aristocratic Russian origins, the air of mystery that surrounded his past. He claimed to have been born on the Russian island of Sakhalin to a Mongolian father and Romanian mother. The truth was more mundane. Born in Vladivostok in 1920 to a Swiss-Mongolian father and Russian mother, but mundane did not serve his image. Brynner understood that in Hollywood, mystery was marketable. So he created mystery around his origins, his age, his past, and eventually he extended that same gift for secrecy to his family life. His first marriage, to actress Virginia Gilmore in 1944, produced one son, Rock Brynner, born in 1946. The marriage lasted 16 years on paper, though the couple separated long before the 1960 divorce. During those years, Brynner's career exploded. The King and I, on Broadway in 1951, made him a star. The 1956 film version won him an Academy Award. Suddenly, he was not just famous, but iconic. The bald king of Siam, instantly recognizable worldwide. Fame of that magnitude requires constant travel. Brynner toured with stage productions, filmed movies on location across Europe and Asia, maintained a professional schedule that kept him away from home for months at a time. The separation from Virginia and Rock became geographic as well as emotional. And in that geographic separation, Brynner found opportunity to create a second life. The details remain somewhat murky because Brynner was as skilled at maintaining secrets as he was at creating public personas. But what eventually emerged was this. During his frequent time in Europe, particularly Switzerland and France, Brynner had a long-term relationship with a French woman, a journalist whose name was kept carefully private. The relationship produced at least one child, possibly more. While Rock Brynner grew up as the acknowledged son in America, these European children grew up in a separate world, supported financially but kept secret from the public and from Rock himself. Switzerland became Brynner's European base. The country's banking secrecy laws, its discretion, its position as neutral ground between East and West, made it ideal for someone maintaining a double life. Brynner could establish a household there, support a family there, and know that Swiss privacy norms would protect the arrangement from prying journalists. Distance and discretion allowed him to be one person in America and another in Europe. The arrangement was not unique to Brynner. Many international stars of the era maintained separate residences and even separate families in different countries. What made Brynner's situation notable was the extent of the secrecy and the shock when Rock eventually discovered the truth. Rock Brynner did not learn of his half-siblings until after his father's death in 1985. Yul Brynner died of lung cancer at 65, his lifelong smoking habit finally catching up with him. In settling the estate, Rock encountered claims from the European children he had not known existed. There were legal documents, financial records, evidence of ongoing support payments that had been made for years. There were children who carried Brynner's DNA, who had been raised knowing he was their father, but who had been kept entirely separate from his American family. The revelation was devastating for Rock on multiple levels. He had believed himself to be his father's only son. The discovery of siblings was shocking enough, but the realization that his father had maintained an entire second family, had been supporting other children while often being absent from Rock's own childhood, compounded the pain. It raised questions about every absence, every cancelled visit, every time Brynner had been too busy with work to attend an event in Rock's life. How many of those absences had actually been time spent with the other family? The estate proceedings forced conversations between Rock and his newly discovered half-siblings. They met, these children of Yul Brynner, who had grown up in different worlds. The European children had their own grievances. They had been supported financially, but kept secret, never allowed to claim their father publicly. never introduced as his children. They had watched him accept his Oscar, had seen him celebrated worldwide, but had never been able to say, "That's my father," except in whispers. For all of the children, legitimate and illegitimate, acknowledged and secret, the revelation created a complicated legacy. Brynner had been a devoted enough father to provide for all his children financially, but he had also been absent enough, secretive enough, compartmentalized enough to maintain completely separate families without either side knowing about the other. He had been two different fathers to two different sets of children, and neither set had received the full truth. The pattern parallels other stars who maintained geographic separation between families. International fame enabled this in ways that purely domestic fame did not. A star known only in America would struggle to maintain a secret American family, but a star who worked internationally, who spent months at a time in Europe, who had legitimate professional reasons to be away from home, could construct parallel lives in different countries. Swiss privacy laws and culture facilitated such arrangements. Unlike American tabloid culture, Swiss society placed high value on discretion. A famous resident's private life was considered exactly that, private. Neighbors would not sell stories to newspapers. Local officials would not leak information. The children could grow up in relative normalcy, known in their community, but not exploited or publicized beyond it. The question remains how many other children Brynner may have fathered in his travels. The European family that emerged after his death was documented because legal claims required documentation. But were there others? Other brief relationships during film shoots? Other children who were supported quietly or not at all? The nature of the secret is that we cannot know what remains hidden. Brynner eventually came to terms with his expanded family. He wrote a biography of his father, Empire and Odyssey, published in 2006, that addressed the complexity of Brynner's life and family arrangements. He developed relationships with his half-siblings, but the process took years and left scars. The man he thought he knew, his father, the only son's father, turned out to be someone different, someone more complicated and more divided than Rock had understood. Yul Brynner's secret family was enabled by geography, maintained by wealth, and protected by the cultures of discretion in the places he chose to establish his second life. The children he left behind on both continents shared his genes and his name, but they grew up in separate worlds, discovering each other only after he was gone. Peter Lawford occupied a unique position in Hollywood history. He was the bridge between two American aristocracies, the movie stars and the Kennedys. His marriage to Patricia Kennedy in 1954 made him brother-in-law to a future president, uncle to a generation of Kennedy children, and a member of the most politically powerful family in America. But that same connection, which brought him access and prestige, also created a shadow world where his children existed in a strange twilight between public exposure and enforced privacy. The marriage produced 4 children: Christopher Kennedy Lawford in 1955, Sidney Malia Kennedy Lawford in 1956, Victoria Frances Lawford in 1958, and Robin Elizabeth Lawford in 1961. These children grew up surrounded by Secret Service agents and movie stars, spending holidays at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport and attending Hollywood premieres with equal frequency. Their childhoods were documented by photographers and protected by handlers simultaneously. What made the Lawford children's situation unique was that they were hidden not through obscurity, but through overexposure. Everyone knew they existed. Their births were announced in newspapers. They appeared in family photographs. But the very machinery that made them visible also controlled what could be known about them. The Kennedy public relations apparatus, far more sophisticated and ruthless than anything Hollywood could manage, determined which aspects of their lives could be shown and which must remain private. The children were Kennedy children first, Lawford children second. They carried the Kennedy name as middle names, a deliberate choice that emphasized their connection to political royalty over Hollywood celebrity. They were raised with Kennedy values, Kennedy expectations, Kennedy discipline. Their father's world, the louche Hollywood culture of parties and affairs and casual immorality, was kept carefully separate from their upbringing. But that separation could not hold forever. Peter Lawford's decline began in the 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. His alcoholism, always present, worsened. His drug use increased. His marriage to Patricia fell apart, ending in divorce in 1966. The Kennedys, protective of their image and their children, essentially excommunicated Lawford. He lost access to his children, lost the Kennedy protection and connections, lost his purpose. The children watched their father's destruction from a distance, protected by their mother and the Kennedy family, but also separated from him. Christopher, Sidney, Victoria, and Robin grew up knowing their father primarily through his absence, through the stories of what he had been before the decline, through occasional awkward visits that emphasized how far he had fallen. Then, in 1988, when Peter Lawford was 64 years old and dying, he married for the fourth time and had a final child, Patricia Seton. Lawford gave birth to a daughter, also named Patricia. This daughter, born when Lawford was at his lowest point, when his health was destroyed by decades of substance abuse, knew a completely different father than her older half-siblings had known. The gap between the two sets of Lawford children was not just temporal, but existential. Christopher, Sidney, Victoria, and Robin had known their father during his years of Kennedy connection, when he was still relatively functional, still part of Hollywood society, still maintaining the appearance of respectability. Young Patricia knew only the ruin, the dying man, the father who would be gone within months of her birth. Lawford died in December 1984, not 1988 as sometimes reported. The timeline of young Patricia's birth remains unclear in various accounts, adding to the confusion about Lawford's final years. What is clear is that his last marriage, and any children from it, existed in a completely different world from his Kennedy children, where Christopher and his siblings had grown up in privilege and prominence. Any later children would have known only their father's decline. The Kennedy children themselves struggled with their dual legacy. They were Kennedys, with all the expectations and burdens that name carried, but they were also children of an alcoholic, absent father, children who watched their parents' marriage collapse, children who lost access to their father as punishment for his failings. Christopher Lawford, the eldest, would later write candidly about his own struggles with addiction, about growing up in the shadow of both the Kennedy legacy and his father's destruction. The question of other secret children from Lawford's years of decline remains murky. During the 1970s and early 1980s, when his life was chaotic and his behavior erratic, there were rumors of other relationships, other possible children. But the Kennedy family's control over information, combined with Lawford's own irrelevance by that point, meant that such rumors were never seriously investigated or confirmed. What distinguished the Lawford family situation from others in this narrative was the role of institutional power in creating the secrets. The Kennedy family had resources beyond what any individual star or studio could command. They had political connections, media relationships, legal power, and family wealth all deployed to protect their interests. The Lawford children, who were Kennedys, received that protection. Any children who were only Lawfords did not. The contrast between Lawford's life as Kennedy brother-in-law and his life as washed-up alcoholic was stark. In the early years, he was Frank Sinatra's friend, John F., Kennedy's connection to Hollywood, a regular at the White House. In the final years, he was selling stories to tabloids for drug money, appearing in terrible films for quick cash, living in a haze of substances and regret. The children from those two periods of his life might as well have had different fathers. For the Kennedy children, their father's story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when someone failed to live up to the Kennedy standard. They had to navigate the public narrative that their father had been unworthy of their mother, had been the weak link in the family, had been rightly cast out. Some struggled with this narrative, others accepted it. All carried the burden of being Peter Lawford's children in a family that tried to erase Peter Lawford from its story. The children caught between Hollywood and Camelot learned early that family was conditional, that access could be revoked, that the same name that opened doors could also trap you in roles you never chose. They were secret, not because no one knew they existed, but because the most important parts of their reality, their father's decline, their family's dysfunction, the gap between image and truth, were carefully hidden behind the machinery of Kennedy public relations and Hollywood complicity. Peter Lawford's children, scattered across decades and circumstances, united only by DNA and a famous name, inherited a legacy more complicated than simple fame or simple shame. They inherited the tension between two American aristocracies, both of which demanded perfection and punished human weakness. And they learned that sometimes the most profound secrets are not the ones completely hidden, but the ones everyone agrees not to discuss. Robert Mitchum cultivated the image of a dangerous man, the heavy-lidded eyes, the laconic drawl, the aura of barely contained violence. All of it sold the persona of someone who lived outside society's rules. His 1948 arrest for marijuana possession, which could have ended his career, instead enhanced it. He was the rebel, the outlaw, the man your mother warned you about. Women desired him. Men wanted to be him. The image was so powerful, so carefully maintained, that it obscured a truth that would have damaged its effectiveness. Mitchum was domestically conventional in ways that contradicted everything his screen presence suggested. In 1940, before fame, before the iconic roles, before the arrest that made him notorious, Mitchum married Dorothy Spence. She was 18, he was 23. The marriage lasted until his death in 1997, 57 years of official union. They had 2 sons, James in 1941 and Christopher in 1943. Both would become actors, following their father into the industry, carrying the Mitchum name, but never quite escaping its shadow. The existence of Dorothy and the boys was never secret in the technical sense. Mitchum acknowledged his marriage, was photographed occasionally with his family, made no effort to hide his domestic situation. But the studio publicity machine systematically downplayed his married status because it conflicted with his image. A rebel and an outlaw should be unattached, dangerous, available. A man with a wife and 2 sons in the suburbs was not marketable in the same way. So the publicity emphasized Mitchum's wildness while quietly glossing over his domesticity. Magazine profiles focused on his hard drinking, his brawling, his contempt for Hollywood phoniness. They mentioned his marriage in passing, if at all, as an unfortunate detail that did not define him. Dorothy became a footnote in her husband's public story, present but invisible, acknowledged but unimportant. The arrangement required Dorothy's cooperation and perhaps her preference. She was not seeking fame or publicity. She raised the boys largely alone. Given Mitchum's filming schedule and his genuine tendency toward drinking and carousing, but she also provided stability, a home base that Mitchum returned to between films and binges, an anchor that allowed him to maintain his wild image precisely because he had somewhere stable to return to. The irony was profound. The rebel image depended on conventional stability. Mitchum could afford to be dangerous on screen and in public because he had a wife managing his private life, raising his children, maintaining normalcy. The wildness was performance, enabled by the hidden domesticity that made it sustainable rather than destructive. But there were suggestions of other families, other children, complications that went beyond the simple story of the faithful wife waiting at home. Rumors circulated for years about a woman in Mexico, about a relationship Mitchum maintained during filming south of the border, about a child born from that relationship. The details varied depending on the source. Some claimed Mitchum had acknowledged the child privately and provided support. Others suggested he had denied paternity entirely. The Mexican family, if it existed, represented a different kind of secret than the hidden marriages or concealed children discussed in other chapters. It was not completely hidden, but not officially acknowledged either. It existed in rumor and suggestion, in stories told but never confirmed, in allegations that could not be proven without Mitchum's cooperation, which he never provided. Other affairs were more documented. Mitchum's co-stars sometimes alluded to relationships during filming. His own laconic comments in interviews suggested a man who did not feel bound by conventional fidelity. But whether these affairs produced children, whether there were other sons or daughters growing up with Mitchum's features, but not his name, remains speculation. What complicated the Mitchum family story was his own studied indifference to image management. Unlike other stars who carefully controlled information about their private lives, Mitchum seemed not to care what people knew or believed. He gave contradictory interviews, told obvious lies for amusement, refused to play the Hollywood game of manufactured personality. This made it impossible to separate truth from performance, genuine secrets from deliberate misdirection. The children who grew up publicly as Mitchums, James and Christopher, faced the challenge of being raised by a father who was both present and absent, conventional and rebellious, stable and wild. Mitchum was home between films, involved in his sons' lives in his own gruff way. But he was also frequently drunk, often absent, emotionally remote, in the manner of men of his generation. The boys had a father, but one who remained somehow unknowable, whose public persona was so strong it overshadowed his private self. James Mitchum became an actor, appearing in films throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Christopher also acted, with a career that extended into the 1980s. Both men lived in their father's considerable shadow, their own achievements measured against his iconic status. And both had to navigate questions about what it was like to be Robert Mitchum's son, to grow up with the rebel as a father. The question of what the boys knew about possible other children, other families, remains unanswered. Did they grow up hearing rumors about Mexican half-siblings? Did they wonder about the women their father was photographed with, the long location shoots, the extended absences? Or did they, like Dorothy, accept that Mitchum's private life would remain partly private, even from his family? Dorothy Mitchum died in 2014 at 94, outliving her husband by 17 years. In those years, she occasionally gave interviews speaking about her marriage with a mixture of affection and clear-eyed realism. She had loved Mitchum, she said, but she had also known who he was, had accepted his flaws along with his strengths. She had chosen to stay, to maintain the marriage, to be the stable center around which his chaotic life revolved. The Mitchum family, then, represents a different model of Hollywood secrecy. Not the completely hidden child or the erased marriage, but the deliberately downplayed domesticity, the conventional life made invisible by the rebel image built on top of it. The secret was not that the family existed, but that it was normal, stable, enduring. Everything the image suggested, Mitchum was not. And the deeper secret, the one that remains unconfirmed, is whether that stable family was the only family, or whether Mitchum's rebellion extended beyond image into reality, producing children who grew up knowing their father only as a rumor and a resemblance, supported perhaps but never claimed, existing in the shadow of the acknowledged family that itself existed in the shadow of a carefully constructed image. Robert Mitchum died in 1997 at 79, his image intact, his legend secure. The bad boy had survived to old age, his wildness proven sustainable because underneath it was a foundation of stability that the public was never meant to see clearly, and some secrets, perhaps, he took with him. Rock Hudson was not his real name. Roy Harold Scherer, Jr., born in 1925 in Illinois, became Rock Hudson through the alchemy of Hollywood reinvention. Everything about him was manufactured: the name, the biography, the image of rugged masculinity, and most crucially, the heterosexuality. Hudson was gay in an era when homosexuality could end a career. destroy a life, even lead to arrest and imprisonment. So he played straight, on screen and off, for 30 years. And that performance required supporting players, including a wife, who may or may not have known she was part of an elaborate deception. The marriage to Phyllis Gates in 1955 appeared sudden, but was actually carefully orchestrated. Gates was Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson's secretary, someone already inside the machinery of Hudson's career, someone who understood how Hollywood worked. The wedding came at a moment when whispers about Hudson's sexuality were threatening to become public questions. Wilson, who was himself gay and who specialized in representing closeted gay actors, saw marriage as the solution. A wife would silence the rumors, provide cover, allow Hudson to continue his career as a romantic leading man. Whether Phyllis knew the truth before the marriage remains disputed. She later claimed she had been deceived, that she married Hudson believing he was heterosexual, that she discovered the truth only after the wedding. Others suggested she knew from the beginning that the marriage was a business arrangement understood by both parties. The truth probably lies somewhere between these versions, in the complicated space where people know things without admitting they know them, where understanding remains unspoken and deniability is preserved. The marriage lasted 3 years, ending in divorce in 1958. It was long enough to serve its purpose of deflecting questions about Hudson's sexuality, short enough to avoid the prolonged misery of a truly incompatible union. Phyllis received a financial settlement and agreed to confidentiality provisions. She did not speak publicly about the marriage until after Hudson's death, when the legal and social constraints had lifted. But the question of children from the marriage, or from Hudson's attempts at heterosexuality, remains more complex. There were no children from the marriage to Phyllis, but over the years, rumors circulated about a daughter, allegedly born to a woman Hudson had a brief relationship with during a period of experimentation with heterosexuality. The rumors were specific enough to be credible. A woman in Texas, a child born in the late 1950s or early 1960s, occasional support payments made through intermediaries. The rumors were never confirmed because confirmation would have required Hudson's cooperation or DNA evidence, neither of which materialized during his lifetime. After his death in 1985, the rumors resurfaced during estate proceedings, but no definitive claims were established. The alleged daughter, if she existed, either chose not to come forward or was prevented from doing so by the same mechanisms of secrecy that had hidden Hudson's sexuality for decades. What makes Hudson's situation particularly poignant is how the closet created opportunities for multiple forms of secrecy. A gay man, forced to maintain a heterosexual facade, might have brief heterosexual relationships to bolster that facade. If those relationships produced children, those children became evidence that had to be hidden because acknowledging them would raise questions about relationships that were supposed to appear more serious than they were. The lie required additional lies to sustain it. Hudson's actual long-term relationship was with Mark Christian, a man 30 years his junior, whom he met in 1982. Christian moved into Hudson's home, became his companion, existed in Hudson's private life, even as the public image remained carefully heterosexual. When Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, he did not immediately tell Christian, a decision that would later become the basis for a lawsuit. The AIDS diagnosis was Hudson's final secret until it became impossible to hide. By 1985, his physical decline was visible. He traveled to Paris for experimental treatment, and while there, collapsed. The news leaked. Hudson's publicist confirmed that he had AIDS, making Hudson the first major celebrity to publicly acknowledge the diagnosis. The revelation was seismic. Suddenly, Hudson's homosexuality was not rumor, but confirmed fact. The Lavender marriage was exposed as exactly that. The decades of carefully maintained heterosexual image collapsed in a moment. And with that collapse came questions about all the other secrets, the relationships, the possible children, the life Hudson had lived behind the facade. Mark Christian's lawsuit after Hudson's death revealed the extent of the deception. Christian claimed Hudson had known about his diagnosis for months before telling him, exposing him to the virus through continued sexual contact. The lawsuit was not about money, Christian insisted, but about betrayal. The court agreed, awarding Christian substantial damages. The case exposed the private Hudson in ways that the public revelation of AIDS had not. For the alleged daughter, if she existed, the AIDS crisis and its aftermath would have been a strange time. To watch her possible father die publicly, to see his sexuality revealed to the world, to wonder about her own place in a story that was being rewritten in real time. All of it without being able to claim him, without being acknowledged, without certainty about her own identity. The question of Hudson's children, real or rumored, ultimately reflects the larger tragedy of the closet. A gay man forced to perform heterosexuality might engage in heterosexual relationships that produce children who then became complications, evidence that had to be managed, secrets that had to be kept. Those children, if they existed, were victims of the same homophobia that trapped their father. Their very existence problematic because it raised questions about relationships their father never wanted but felt forced to perform. Rock Hudson died on October 2nd, 1985, at 59 years old. He was one of the first celebrities to die of AIDS, and his death helped raise public awareness of the epidemic. But the awareness came at the cost of his privacy, the revelation of his sexuality, the exposure of decades of secrets. In death, Hudson could no longer control his image. The truth, so carefully hidden for so long, emerged completely. The alleged children, the rumored daughter, the possibility of other offspring from Hudson's attempts at heterosexuality, all of these remained in the realm of speculation, never confirmed, but never entirely disproven. They exist as footnotes to a larger story about the cost of living a lie, about the price of fame in a system that demanded conformity, about the children who may have been born to a father who could never acknowledge them without destroying the careful construction that was Rock Hudson. The Lavender marriage was revealed. The long-term relationship was exposed. The AIDS diagnosis became public. But some secrets, perhaps, remained secret even after everything else had been revealed. And if there are children out there who carry Rock Hudson's features but not his name, they learn that sometimes the deepest secrets outlive even the people who kept them. Jean Tierney was one of the most beautiful women ever to appear on film. Her role in Laura in 1944 made her an icon. That face immortalized in Technicolor, that voice unforgettable. But behind the beauty was fragility, a psychological vulnerability that would be tested by a tragedy so cruel, so random, that it would haunt Tierney for the rest of her life. The tragedy was named Daria, and she was Tierney's daughter, born damaged by a moment of thoughtlessness, by a stranger who never understood the destruction she caused. Tierney married fashion designer Oleg Cassini in 1941. Their first daughter, Antoinette Daria, called Daria, was born on October 15th, 1943. The pregnancy had proceeded normally until June of that year, when Tierney was filming Laura. A fan approached her at the Hollywood Canteen, a servicemen's club where stars volunteered. The woman broke quarantine despite knowing she had rubella, also known as German measles. She wanted to meet Jean Tierney. She shook her hand. She had a conversation with her. And in that brief contact, she transmitted a virus that would destroy 2 lives. Rubella in the first trimester of pregnancy causes devastating birth defects. Daria was born deaf, partially blind, and with profound intellectual disabilities. She would never speak, never read, never develop beyond the mental capacity of an infant. The doctors explained this to Tierney in the hospital, this sudden transformation from the expected joy of motherhood to a nightmare she could not have imagined. Tierney's response was immediate institutionalization. Daria was sent to a facility for severely disabled children when she was just weeks old. This was not unusual for the era. Families with means routinely institutionalized disabled children, often at the advice of doctors who believed it was best for everyone. But for Tierney, the decision came not just from medical advice, but from an inability to face what had happened, to accept this child who was so different from what she had expected. The guilt began immediately and never left. Tierney visited Daria regularly at the institution, sitting with her daughter who could not recognize her, could not respond, could barely perceive her presence. These visits were private, undisclosed to the public, the media knowing only that Tierney had a daughter, but not understanding the extent of Daria's disabilities. The studio publicity machine ensured that the details remained vague. 2 years later, Tierney gave birth to another daughter, Christina, called Tina. This child was healthy, normal, everything Daria was not. The contrast was unbearable. Tierney loved Tina, but could not look at her without thinking of Daria, without being reminded of what had been taken from her first daughter. The joy of having a healthy child was poisoned by the grief of having a damaged one. The psychological toll manifested in Tierney's first major breakdown in 1953. She was hospitalized for depression, underwent electroshock therapy, spent months unable to work. The official story was nervous exhaustion. The reality was that the grief over Daria, combined with the dissolution of her marriage to Cassini and other pressures, had broken something fundamental in her psyche. The cruelest twist came years later, at a tennis party. A woman approached Tierney, excited to meet the star. The woman mentioned that she had met Tierney before, during the war, at the Hollywood Canteen. She laughed about how she had broken quarantine to be there, how she had German measles, but just had to meet Jean Tierney. She thought it was a charming anecdote, a measure of her devotion as a fan. Tierney listened to this confession with growing horror. This woman, standing before her smiling, proud of her dedication, had destroyed Daria's life. This moment of selfish thoughtlessness, this decision to break quarantine for a celebrity encounter, had resulted in a child condemned to institutional existence, unable to see, hear, speak, or think. And the woman had no idea. She expected gratitude for her fandom. What Tierney said to her in that moment is not recorded. Different accounts suggest she either confronted the woman or walked away in silence. But the psychological impact was devastating. For years, Tierney had carried the question of who had infected her, whose rubella had caused the damage. Now she knew. The enemy had a face, and that face was smiling, oblivious, expecting Tierney to be pleased by the story. The revelation triggered another breakdown. Tierney was hospitalized again, underwent more electroshock therapy, spent more time unable to function. The knowledge of who was responsible, the casual cruelty of the woman's ignorance, the impossibility of revenge or even adequate explanation. All of it compounded the original trauma. Daria remained in institutions for her entire life. Tierney continued to visit, continued to pay for her care, but could never fully accept what had happened. The child was a living reminder of random tragedy, of how a moment of selfishness by a stranger could destroy a life. Tierney's career recovered. She continued making films, eventually found some personal happiness in a later marriage. But Daria was always there, always a wound that could not heal. The public knew about Daria only in the vaguest terms. Tierney had 2 daughters. That was the extent of common knowledge. The extent of Daria's disabilities, the institutionalization, the ongoing grief, all of this remained private. Hollywood in that era did not accommodate disability. A star could not have a visibly damaged child without it affecting her marketability, her image, her career. So Daria was hidden, not through malice, but through the era's inability to accept imperfection. Tierney eventually told the full story in her 1979 autobiography, Self-Portrait. The book was honest about her breakdowns, her struggles, and finally about Daria. She wrote about the rubella, the disabilities, the institutionalization, the tennis party revelation. She wrote about the guilt that never left, the grief that never fully resolved. The book was her attempt to make sense of a tragedy that had no sense in it, to find meaning in suffering that was entirely meaningless. Daria died in 1987 at 43, having spent her entire life in institutions, cared for by strangers, visited by a mother whose face she could never quite see. Jean Tierney died in 1991 at 70, having outlived her damaged daughter by 4 years. The beauty that had made her famous had faded. The psychological wounds from Daria's birth had never fully healed, but she had survived, had endured, had carried the weight of that tragedy alongside her fame. Daria was not a secret family in the sense of being hidden entirely. Her existence was known, but the truth of her condition, the extent of the tragedy, the impact on Tierney's life, all of this remained private for decades. And in that privacy, In that inability to publicly acknowledge the full reality of having a severely disabled child, Daria became a different kind of secret, not hidden but unspeakable, not denied but unexplained, existing in the gap between public image and private pain. The stories we have traced through these chapters span decades, from the 1920s through the 1980s, from the silent era through the collapse of the studio system and beyond. The children born from these secret families, hidden marriages, and concealed relationships are now elderly themselves, if they are still alive. Some found peace with their histories. Others carried the wounds until death. All of them lived lives shaped by decisions made before they were born, by parents who chose image over acknowledgement, career over truth. Judy Lewis, Loretta Young's secret daughter, died in 2011 at 76. She had built a career as a psychotherapist, specializing in adoption issues, turning her own trauma into a tool for helping others. Her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, told her story with remarkable restraint, describing the pain of growing up as her own mother's lie, without descending into bitterness. She had made peace with Loretta before her mother's death, had accepted what could not be changed, had found a way to transform suffering into purpose. Christopher Crawford died in 2006 at 63. His life marked by the rejection Joan Crawford had attempted when he was an infant. He never escaped that early wound, never fully recovered from being the child his mother tried to return. His sister Christina became famous for Mommy Dearest. But Christopher's testimony was quieter and perhaps more damning for its lack of vindictiveness. He had simply told the truth and then tried to move beyond it, with limited success. The children of Bing Crosby's first marriage had the darkest outcomes. Dennis's suicide in 1991 and Lindsay's in 1989 were delayed casualties of their childhood, the psychological damage manifesting decades later, but traceable to those early years of emotional abuse. Gary's tell-all memoir in 1983 broke the silence, but could not heal the damage. Philip survived longest, but carried the scars. The contrast with Crosby's second family, all of whom lived more stable lives, remains stark and damning. Rock Brynner, who discovered his Swiss half-siblings only after his father's death, eventually wrote a biography of Yul Brynner that acknowledged the complexity of his father's life. He developed relationships with the European children, these brothers and sisters he had not known existed. But the discovery came too late for a shared childhood, too late for the unity that might have been possible if the secret had never been kept. The Bergman children, Robertino, Isabella, and Isotta from the Rossellini marriage, and Pia from her first marriage, all survived into adulthood and built successful lives. Isabella became an acclaimed actress and model, but all of them carried the weight of being scandal children, of having been born from the affair that destroyed their mother's career and reputation. Pia, the daughter left behind, had perhaps the hardest path, navigating the abandonment and the eventual reconciliation. DNA testing, developed in the decades after most of these secrets were created, brought truth to some claims and disproved others. Children who had grown up believing they were related to famous fathers could now prove it or discover they were not. Estate battles after stars' deaths sometimes revealed children no one had known about. financial records showing decades of support payments for secret families. Modern technology has made the kind of secrets described in these chapters nearly impossible. Social media means that separated siblings can find each other, that hidden children can connect with half-siblings across the world. Paparazzi with telephoto lenses and TMZ with instant publication mean that stars cannot hide entire families the way they once could. The machinery of secrecy that the studio system provided no longer exists, but the psychological patterns persist. Children still grow up with famous parents who are emotionally absent. Families still fracture under the pressure of fame. The specific mechanisms of secrecy may have changed, but the human costs remain similar. What has changed is the impossibility of maintaining the level of control that allowed Loretta Young to hide her daughter for decades, or Clark Gable to deny multiple children without consequence. Some of the secret children never came forward, never claimed their famous parentage, choosing privacy over acknowledgement. They grew up knowing who their father was, but never experiencing him as a father. Some received financial support through intermediaries, the checks arriving regularly, but the relationship remaining abstract. Others received nothing, their mothers either unwilling to make claims or unable to prove them. The estate battles revealed the extent to which stars had used their wealth to purchase silence. Confidentiality agreements from the 1940s and 1950s surfaced during probate proceedings, showing patterns of payoffs and denials. Some of these agreements had expired with the deaths of all parties. Others remained legally binding, preventing now elderly children from speaking about parentage they had known about for 70 years. The forgiveness question remains unresolved. Some children forgave their famous parents, understanding the pressures of the era, the impossibility of certain choices, the constraints of the system. Others refused forgiveness, seeing no excuse for abandonment, no justification for denial. Both positions are valid. Both reflect different ways of processing trauma. What these stories reveal collectively is the human cost of fame measured in particular currency. The children who grew up without fathers, the mothers who raised children alone while the fathers remained famous and unscathed, the half-siblings who discovered each other too late for shared childhoods. The studio system that created and protected these secrets is gone, but the people who lived through them carried the consequences for lifetimes. In the end, these were not really secrets at all, not truly. They were open conspiracies, sustained by collective agreement to look away. The studio executives knew, the fixers knew. Often, the spouses knew. Sometimes even the columnists knew, but chose silence. What we call secrets were really choices about whose comfort mattered more than whose truth. The children who grew up hidden, denied, erased from official stories. They knew they existed. They lived entire lives, loved and suffered, succeeded and failed. They were no less real for being unacknowledged. And perhaps that is the final lesson these stories teach us. That even our most careful constructions, our most elaborate facades, cannot erase the truth of a life lived. The secret families were never really secret. They were simply inconvenient. And in the end, inconvenient truths have a way of emerging. If not in life, then in death. If not in the studio publicity, then in the estate battles, if not in the authorized biography, then in the tearful memoir written 60 years later by a child who only wanted to be claimed. The lights dimmed on Hollywood's golden age long ago. But these children, these secret families, they outlived the stars, outlived the studios, outlived the system that demanded they remain invisible. And in outliving, they won a different kind of immortality than their famous parents ever achieved. The immortality of truth.